I didn't plan on starting a war that morning. I honestly just wanted to drink my coffee on the dock behind my house, a dock I believed was as normal and unquestioned as the sunrise. But the moment I stepped outside, the sound of furious voices cracked through the calm, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. A group of HOA board members, clipboards in hand, neon safety vests on like they were federal agents, were gathered on the shoreline, pointing straight at my dock as if they had discovered a crime scene. That was the moment everything changed. I had no idea they were about to accuse me of illegally using what I had always known to be mine. I also had no idea they'd filed formal violation notices behind my back, or that they planned to fine me thousands for unauthorized structure usage. But the worst part? They had already convinced the rest of the neighborhood that I was squatting on their lake. As I walked closer, Wanda jabbed a finger at me like she was issuing a warrant. "You've had a free ride long enough," she declared. "The HOA owns every dock on this lake, including that one, and we're taking it back." For a split second, I almost laughed. But then I noticed two uniformed officers standing behind them, hands resting on their belts, watching me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an ambush. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. Instead, something cold settled in my chest, a strange mix of disbelief, anger, and a sudden, sharp clarity. Because while they didn't know it, I had something they couldn't possibly expect. Hidden in a fireproof safe inside my office was a set of documents older than the HOA itself, documents I'd never shown anyone. Documents that didn't just prove ownership of my dock, but ownership of every single dock on the lake. The HOA thought they had cornered me. They had no idea I was holding the real power. As Wanda stepped forward to announce they were issuing an immediate removal order, I felt the tide shift, not on the lake, but inside me. They thought this battle was already won. They were about to learn they just declared war on the wrong homeowner. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of the day, everything they believed about the lake, the docks, and their authority would crumble. And the truth buried in those papers would flip the power balance in a way none of them imagined. The moment the HOA confrontation ended, I walked back into my house with my heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of a sharp, focused determination I hadn't felt in years. They wanted to play games. Fine. I had the winning hand sealed in a metal box tucked behind old tax folders in my office closet. As I closed the door behind me, the muffled voices of Wanda and her clipboard brigade echoed faintly from the lake. Let them talk. They had no idea what was coming. I pulled the fireproof safe from the shelf, the one my father had given me before he passed. "Everything you need is in here," he had told me once, "even if you don't know it yet." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, that sentence felt like prophecy. Entering the code, I opened the safe and carefully lifted out a thick bundle of documents wrapped in aging plastic sleeves. Deeds, surveys, maps, some handwritten, some typed on yellowed paper with faded ink. They smelled like history and carried the weight of something bigger than any HOA rulebook. I laid them across my desk. My hands shook, not with nerves, but with anticipation. The first document was the original land grant for the entire shoreline, dated nearly 60 years before the neighborhood existed. The second was the transfer of ownership from the original developer to my father, recorded long before the HOA was even formed. And then came the real bombshell, the clause stating that dock rights were permanently attached to the original parcel owners and could not be overwritten, transferred, or seized by any future governing body. In plain language, every dock on the lake was legally owned by my family. Every single one. Not leased. Not community property. Not under HOA jurisdiction. Owned. I sat back in my chair, stunned for a moment. My father had never explained why he insisted on keeping every piece of paperwork. Now I understood. He had known someday someone would try to challenge what was ours. And he wanted to make sure I'd be ready. A slow, almost involuntary smile crept across my face. The HOA thought they were dealing with some clueless homeowner who'd crumble at the threat of fines and made up authority. But what I had spread out across my desk wasn't just paperwork, it was a legal shield sharp enough to cut every claim they threw my way. I didn't rush. I scanned each page, highlighting key sections, printing copies, preparing everything with the precision of someone gearing up for a courtroom showdown. Because I knew exactly what would happen next, they'd corner me again. They'd push harder. They'd demand compliance. But this time, I would be ready. And when I walked out to meet them, their entire world would shift. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was practically boiling. Wanda had already blasted out a dramatic message claiming I was refusing lawful HOA directives, and that further enforcement action was being considered. Several neighbors chimed in with comments ranging from confused to downright hostile. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, not yet. I gathered my documents into a clean folder, slipped it under my arm, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the lake calm, but the tension hanging over the shore felt heavy enough to break. As expected, the moment I walked toward my dock, Wanda and two other board members marched up like they'd been waiting all morning to pounce. "There you are," Wanda snapped. "We're issuing a final notice. You have 48 hours to remove this illegal structure or the HOA will take action." I didn't flinch. Instead, I opened the folder and held up the first document. "Before you try that," I said calmly, "you might want to read this." She scoffed, reaching for it with an attitude that made it clear she expected some meaningless printout from Google. But as her eyes skimmed the page, her expression shifted, first annoyance, then confusion, then something else entirely. Something like panic. This is decades old," she muttered. "Correct," I replied. "It's the original shoreline grant. Notice the date. Notice the signatures." Behind her, the other board members leaned in, their confidence faltering. I handed them the second document, the recorded transfer to my father. Wanda's face tightened. The third document, the clause binding dock rights exclusively to the original landowner, hit them like a brick. "You can't expect us to believe this overrides our bylaws," the treasurer sputtered. "It doesn't override them," I said. "It predates them. Which means your bylaws never applied to this property. You can't claim authority over something you never legally controlled." Silence washed over the shoreline, thick and stunned. Wanda's lips pressed into a hard line. "We'll need to consult legal counsel." "You should," I said. "I already did." That was a bluff, but it worked. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. The HOA operated on intimidation, not facts. And for the first time, they weren't the ones holding the upper hand. I tucked the documents back into the folder, locked eyes with Wanda, and added, "Until your lawyer explains what those papers already make clear, you will not issue another notice, step on my dock, or attempt enforcement. Because from this moment forward, you're operating outside your own authority." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Their fortress of control had cracked and they knew it. For 2 full days, the HOA went silent, eerily silent. No emails, no warnings taped to my door, no angry knocks demanding compliance. Wanda's group chat tirade suddenly stopped. Even the neighbors who usually gossiped on morning walks avoided eye contact. It felt like that strange, unsettling calm right before a storm finally breaks. And on the third morning, it broke. I was sipping coffee on my dock, the one they swore was illegal, when a line of cars rolled up to the shoreline parking area. First came Wanda's sedan, then the treasurer's SUV, then a car I didn't recognize at all. Out stepped a tall man in a suit, adjusting his glasses and carrying a briefcase. "HOA legal counsel. The cavalry." Wanda squared her shoulders like she had personally summoned a hero who would vanquish me with a single letter of authority. She marched toward my dock with the confidence of someone who believed she had just won. "Good morning," the lawyer called as they approached. I've reviewed the matter regarding the dock dispute. I nodded, perfectly calm. Then you've seen the documents. He opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of printed papers. My papers. Highlighted. Notated. Thoroughly examined. Yes, he said. And I have to be very clear, the HOA has no legal standing here. Wanda blinked. I'm sorry. That can't be correct. Our bylaws. Your bylaws, he interrupted gently but firmly, do not and never have applied to these dock rights. The original shoreline grant supersedes any HOA authority. The deed transfer is legitimate. The rights are legally binding. And the clause prohibits reassignment or seizure. He wasn't speaking to me, he was speaking at Wanda. Her mouth fell open. But we've always managed the docks. And you've done so without legal jurisdiction, he replied. Going forward, the board must cease all enforcement, communication, and oversight regarding these docks. Immediately. The treasurer's face drained of color. Another board member muttered a stunned, "Oh my God." The lawyer continued, "If the board proceeds with further action, you will expose the HOA to liability. Significant liability." Wanda's voice cracked. "So you're saying, he owns them? All of them?" The lawyer closed his briefcase. "Yes. Every single dock on this lake is his private property." Silence rippled across the shoreline. Even the geese seemed to quiet down. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply looked at Wanda, this woman who had tried to bulldoze her way into stealing something she never had a right to, and said, "Next time, ask before you accuse." She didn't respond. She couldn't. By the end of the day, the HOA issued a formal written apology to me and the entire neighborhood. And just like that, the myth of their absolute power shattered. Not because I fought harder, but because I had the truth on my side. In the days following the HOA's forced apology, the entire neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight no one realized existed had finally been lifted. People who once avoided me now waved awkwardly from their yards. A few even approached with cautious smiles, clearly trying to rewrite history in their favor. It was strange watching the social landscape rearrange itself around a single truth: the HOA wasn't invincible. And the dock dispute had exposed just how fragile their authority really was. But the biggest shift came a week later, when the HOA announced an emergency community meeting. Normally, these gatherings were tedious affairs, endless debates about mailbox colors or lawn heights, but this one was different. The clubhouse parking lot overflowed with residents whispering anxiously. They weren't there to argue. They were there to confront. I walked in quietly, taking a seat in the back. Wanda sat at the front table looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Papers were piled in front of her, but her usual fire was gone. Beside her sat the treasurer and secretary, both visibly uneasy. The meeting opened with the lawyer reading a formal statement. The HOA had acted outside its legal authority. They had issued illegitimate enforcement notices. And they had jeopardized the neighborhood financially through reckless governance. Gasps spread through the room. The lawyer wasn't done. He continued with findings from a deeper review. Several other rules the HOA had been enforcing for years weren't enforceable at all. Parking restrictions. Lake usage limitations. Even parts of the architectural guidelines. All invalid. The room erupted. Residents who had been fined, threatened, or intimidated over the years began speaking up one after another. Voices cracked with frustration, anger, relief. Stories poured out like water from a bursting dam. And then someone asked the question everyone was thinking. Who approved all these actions? All eyes shifted to Wanda. She stood, gripping the podium with trembling hands. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked human. Not villainous. Not powerful. Just overwhelmed. "We acted in good faith," she said weakly. "We believed we had authority." "But you didn't," someone shouted. "You never did," said another. "And you find us anyway." Voices clashed, people standing, demanding accountability. The treasurer tried to calm the crowd, but the damage was done. Trust was gone. Finally, the lawyer raised a hand. "In light of these findings," he announced, "the board will be stepping down effective immediately. A new election will be held." The room fell silent. Wanda sank into her chair, defeated. The era of her rule was over, not because I set out to destroy her, but because the truth unraveled everything she'd built her power on. As the meeting ended, residents approached me not with hostility, but with gratitude. For standing my ground. For exposing the truth. For showing them the cracks in a system they thought was unshakable. I simply nodded. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. In the weeks after the board's resignation, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Without the HOA looming over every mailbox and flower bed, people didn't quite know how to function. Some were relieved. Some were confused. A few were openly panicked, afraid chaos would break out without Wanda policing shrubs and dock ropes. But for me, something else changed entirely. For the first time in years, I could walk down to the lake without feeling watched. My docks stood peacefully in the early morning sun. The water rippled gently, reflecting the sky like a sheet of glass. It didn't look like a battleground anymore. It looked like home. One afternoon, as I was tightening a rope on one of the docks, a neighbor approached a man named Greg who had lived here longer than I had but never once spoken more than a passing hello. "I owe you an apology," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "About all this?" I didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath and continued. "We trusted the HOA. We thought they knew what they were doing. When they said you were violating rules, we believed it. I believed it." He paused, looking genuinely ashamed. "Turns out they didn't even understand the rules themselves." I nodded slowly. "It happens. Power makes people think they're right, even when they're not." He chuckled ruefully. "Yeah. Well, thanks for standing up to them. Most of us never would have dared." That conversation repeated itself in different forms over the coming days. Neighbors who once voted in favor of HOA crackdowns apologized. Some asked questions about the history of the lake. Others simply wanted reassurance that everything was going to be okay. And strangely, I didn't mind answering them. One morning, while organizing the old documents in my office, I came across something I hadn't noticed before: a handwritten note from my father tucked between pages. "Ownership isn't about control. It's about responsibility. Someday, this will matter more than you know." I sat back, letting the meaning settle in. Maybe this whole ordeal wasn't just about proving the HOA wrong. Maybe it was about understanding that what I inherited wasn't just legal authority, it was stewardship. The next time I walked around the lake, I looked at the docks differently. Not as leverage. Not as trophies of a victory. But as something worth protecting, worth caring for, worth sharing properly. By the end of the month, a temporary committee formed, one not tied to an HOA, to discuss how to manage the shoreline responsibly, fairly, and legally. And instead of resisting, the neighbors asked me to join. Not because I owned the docks. But because, for the first time, they trusted me. And as I stood on the lake's edge, the sun setting over the water, I realized something powerful. The battle with the HOA didn't just restore what was mine. It gave the entire community a second chance. The first meeting of the new Shoreline Committee was nothing like an HOA meeting. No gavel. No lecturing. No tense faces waiting for someone to break a rule. Instead, we met in a neighbor's backyard overlooking the lake, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, pitchers of lemonade on a table, and the kind of atmosphere that felt human. People talked instead of argued. They listened instead of barked orders. For the first time since I'd moved into this neighborhood, it felt like we were acting like a community. But as the meeting went on, I realized something unexpected. Most of them had no idea how the lake actually came to be. They knew the HOA had managed it, but they didn't know the real story behind its ownership, the original land use agreements, or why the dock rights were structured the way they were. So, after some discussion about maintenance and safety, all eyes slowly turned toward me. "Can you explain it?" a woman named Erin asked. "How you ended up owning the docks? And why the documents were so different from what the HOA told us?" There was no challenge in her voice. No suspicion. Just genuine curiosity. I nodded and took a moment before speaking. "The lake wasn't built by the HOA," I said. "It was created as part of a private development long before this neighborhood existed. The developer built the shoreline, the boat ramps, the docks, everything. But when the development changed hands, not everything transferred the way people assumed." I opened the folder I had brought and held up one of the maps. "This," I continued, "is the original layout. My father bought this entire section decades ago. He negotiated the dock rights with the developer, and the agreement permanently tied those rights to our property. The HOA never acquired them because they never existed for the HOA to take." A quiet murmur moved through the group. "But the HOA always acted like someone began." "Exactly," I said. "They acted like they owned it. But acting and owning aren't the same thing." People exchanged glances. Some nodded slowly, processing the truth. Others looked upset, not at me, but at how easily they had been misled. A man who rarely spoke, Mr. Lang from the corner house, leaned forward. "So all those years, the fees, the threats, the restrictions, none of it was legitimate?" "Not when it came to the lake," I said. "They believed they had authority, but belief isn't law. And when people in power stop questioning their authority, they start abusing it." A heavy silence followed. Not angry, just reflective. For the first time, the community wasn't blaming me. They weren't blaming each other. They were blaming the system that had tricked them into thinking control meant safety. Then Erin said softly, "Thank you. Not for owning the docks, but for showing us the truth." And in that moment, something shifted again. Not power, not authority, but understanding. The lake finally belonged to all of us in the way it was always meant to. Not through control, but through clarity. A few days after the Shoreline Committee meeting, I found myself sorting through the last of my father's old files. I didn't expect to find anything new. Most of the critical documents had already been uncovered, but something compelled me to look anyway. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was closure. Or maybe, deep down, I sensed there was still a piece of the story I didn't fully understand. Tucked in the back of the drawer, behind a stack of outdated property tax receipts, I found a thin envelope sealed with tape so yellowed it crumbled when I touched it. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting. I recognized it instantly, neat, careful, and deliberate. The letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to future owner of the lake docks. I sat down slowly. The letter explained everything: the negotiations with the original developer, the reason the rights had been written the way they were, and why he had insisted I keep every document safe. But there was something else woven between the lines, a warning. "One day," he wrote, "people will try to take what they do not understand. They will claim it for convenience, not truth. When that day comes, you must protect what is rightfully yours, but not out of pride. Protect it so the lake remains what it was always meant to be, a place for community, not control." For a long moment, I just sat there, the weight of those words pressing into me. Everything suddenly snapped into focus: the hostility, the power grabs, the fines, the threats. Wanda and the old HOA weren't just controlling, they were terrified of losing control. They had built their authority on assumptions, not facts. And when facts surfaced, the tower they'd constructed collapsed instantly. Later that evening, I walked down to the water. The sun was dipping low, turning the lake into molten gold. Kids were playing on one of the docks, my docks, but for once, the sight didn't make me tense. It made me proud. For years, the HOA had used the docks as leverage. They restricted them, regulated them, weaponized them. But now, under the new committee, the community was finally using them the way they should have been from the beginning, openly, respectfully, without fear of some clipboard-wielding official ordering them off. As I stood there, Aaron walked over, giving me a small smile. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking." "About the past?" she asked. I nodded. "And how it shaped all of this?" She glanced at the lake. "Well, whatever your dad set in motion, it ended up helping everyone." For the first time in a long time, I felt that truth settle inside me, not like a burden, but like a purpose. The lake wasn't just legally mine. It was part of my family's legacy. And now, it was part of the community's future. The weeks following the discovery of my father's letter marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The docks, once symbols of tension and control, had transformed into gathering points. Families fished from them, children learned to swim, and neighbors who had barely nodded at each other now shared stories and laughter on the very planks that had caused so much conflict. The lake had become a place of connection, exactly as my father had hoped. The new Shoreline Committee took its responsibilities seriously. Unlike the old HOA, decisions were made collectively. Maintenance schedules were transparent. Safety measures were agreed upon openly. Every neighbor had a voice, and every voice mattered. No one could unilaterally enforce rules or levy fines. And best of all, the community had a newfound respect for the legal truth behind the docks. Knowledge had replaced fear. I found myself in a unique position, not as a ruler, but as a guardian. I shared my father's documents with the committee, ensuring everyone understood the legal framework. People asked questions, I answered. Conflicts that would have escalated into shouting matches under the old HOA were now solved calmly. It was a revelation how much smoother life became when authority was rooted in fact, not assumption. One evening, I stood on my favorite dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The water reflected the fiery sky, and the gentle lap of the lake against the pilings created a rhythm that felt timeless. Across the shore, neighbors chatted as they launched a canoe, kids laughed while skipping stones, and a couple of older residents sat in quiet conversation. Everything felt right. I thought about Wanda, the treasurer, and the rest of the old board. I didn't feel anger anymore, only a strange sort of pity. They had been blinded by the illusion of power. Their mistakes had been monumental, but in the end, the truth had a way of asserting itself. The lake and the community were stronger because of it. The most surprising part of all this? I realized the battle wasn't just about docks or property rights. It was about trust, communication, and integrity. The lake had been a battleground, yes, but it had also become a classroom. Every dispute, every document, every confrontation taught us something invaluable about honesty, patience, and the importance of standing firm in the truth. As darkness fell and the stars began to glitter above the water, I felt a deep sense of peace. The docks were mine, legally, but more importantly, they were ours, practically. My father's foresight had preserved not just property, but community. And that was a victory far greater than any legal battle. The lake wasn't just a lake anymore. It was a testament to resilience, clarity, and justice. And it had finally found its rightful place in the hands of those who would respect it forever.